From Atlanta, Georgia, welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast for women on leadership and life skills with Mack Story. Mack shares powerful life and leadership principles, helping you maximize your potential and become the woman God created you to be.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode on facing fear of change. I talk about, the fear that we create in our lives, and most of the fears that we have are completely unfounded. And what we find is that when we let those fears control us or influence us, then we let them determine us in a sense. And so the power is realizing that just because we have the fear doesn't mean we have to react to it or respond to it or let it control or dictate our behavior. Everyone has fears, and fear is kind of what happens when anxiety becomes overwhelming. It's a strong emotion, and there's no doubt, and it occurs when we believe there's a possibility of something bad or negative, when there's a threat or a danger. But what happens is that we often spend a lot of our time and energy worried about or afraid of things that might actually never happen. In fact, the vast majority of our fears are completely unfounded. And so it's realizing that when we start to feel that fear emotion take over, we have to really consciously move our thoughts away from it and focusing on something better. Because when we fear change, what we're really afraid of is that we won't like the new status quo. We won't like the future. And when we fear change, we're fearful that we're going to end up somehow worse off than we are now. We feel a loss when we fear change. And so we're afraid of that. Now, change can bring fear anytime when we form our identity around or place our security in something outside of ourselves. In other words, our locus or our center of control should be within ourselves rather than forming our sense of who we are and our sense of identity around something else. So I'll give you an example. If your sense of self and your sense of success for yourself is centered around your job, then any changes involving your job are going to cause fear and anxiety because the job is how you've defined yourself. If your security is centered and founded on your family and your role as a parent, then fear can come when your kids grow up and move away. That's more than just an empty nest feeling. But if your sense of identity is completely wrapped up in your role as a parent, then when that role changes, it brings with it a lot of fear and a lot of sense of loss. So what we really have to do is, number one, focus on our sense of control, our sense of self, our sense of identity has to be formed on who we are as individuals. That is, the values that we have as an individual. So if you place your sense of self on your internal values, then your security is based on your inner worth, your inner self. And those internal values that you have are the foundation for which you build your identity. So that means the external situations don't have as much of an impact. The changes in our environment don't rock our world the same way when we have that strong foundation of values in who we are. So, I love to break this down, and there are 3 common fears related to change. I want to share those with you and then a little bit of insight on how to overcome those, because I think this is really powerful. I know a lot of us deal with fear and fear of change particularly, because there again, when we have that fear of change, we are just afraid that the future is not going to be as good as what we have right now. And sometimes that allows us to miss opportunities. So 3 common fears related to change. Number 1, fear of the unknown. As people, we typically like to see what's coming. Most of us don't like big surprises in the areas that are truly important to us. So then we start worrying about what happens. We spend time thinking, what if? And frequently those fears are never realized. So to overcome fear of the unknown, it's important to focus on the facts of the situation rather than telling yourself stories that may or may not be true. So when there's fear of the unknown, that's what it's really important to do, is focusing on the facts, rather than worrying or being afraid of all the elements that we cannot control. Let's focus on the facts of the situation, what actually is there and present. And don't create a story around the facts. We are so good as people at making up stories for around a set of facts. But when we just focus on the facts and rather than create the story, we take out the emotion that sometimes gets us off track, certainly. Number two, fear of losing control. Having control means we can get what we want. And more control equals more options. So we love that because life is better when we have more options. Absolutely. And we as people love the freedom to make decisions. We fear situations where we lose control because that means we have fewer choices. So to overcome the fear of loss of control, we must focus on what we can control. And I talked about that in just a minute ago, and fear of the unknown. But really, when we're afraid of losing control of something, we need to turn our attention consciously to what we can control. And I may have touched on this in a previous episode, but this exercise is so powerful. And it's based on a graph in Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And what I love to do is when I'm feeling some of those fears come up, what I love to do is draw a big circle on a piece of paper, like get an 8x10 sheet of paper and write down and, draw a big circle that fills up the whole page and write down in that circle, all of the things that I may be worried about or concerned about or things that are just going on or weighing in my mind. Brainstorm them, get them all out, write them down on that piece of paper. And that's our circle of concern, right? Stephen Covey calls that the circle of concern. It's all of the things that we are concerned or worried about. And what we should do is draw a smaller circle inside the circle of concern. And in that circle, we write down all the things that we can control or influence. And this is our circle of influence. And Stephen Covey talks about in his book, when we focus on the circle of influence, what we will find is that circle of influence will expand over time because we're focusing our attention on things that we can control, things that we can change. And when we do that, the things that we can control and influence grow over time. And last but not least, number 3, fear of loss. I love to use the analogy of a little boy, a 4-year-old little boy who learns he's going to be a big brother. And he's excited initially because it sounds super fun. And then he realizes his relationship to one of the most important people in his world is changing. And he starts to become afraid of losing his mom. What if she doesn't have time for me anymore? What if she loves the new baby more than she loves me? And so he starts to create fear of loss. And really, to overcome the fear of loss, we have to turn our attention to focusing on the gains the change will bring instead of the loss, because we can't focus on the loss. If we do, we find that we just start that downward spiral. But focus on the opportunities, focus on the positives. And I know all of this says easy and does hard. Believe me, I know that. And I know some days it's easier than others. Some days it's tougher than others. But we absolutely have the power to do it. We just have to be intentional about creating that in our mind, focusing our control where we want it to go and directing it. Because where Oprah Winfrey said, what we focus on expands. And it's so true. What we tend to worry about or think about or fear is going to just become bigger and bigger in our own mind, certainly, if not in life. And, it's really realizing that ultimately the power is in ourself, within ourself, is to change what we think and how we think, and that changes our circumstances around us. John Wooden, one quote to leave you with as we close on this podcast episode. John Wooden said, "Failure is not fatal, but failure to deal with change might be." And I love that. Failure is not fatal, but failure to deal with change might be. So rather than having a fear of change, embrace it. Look for the opportunities. Maybe it's just brainstorming what's in your circle of influence and focusing your energy on those things instead of the circle of concern. So, love to hear your feedback if you actually go through that exercise and just hear how it. I'd love to hear from you how it clarifies your thinking, just because this has been a really powerful way for me to deal with fear of change in the past. Until next time.
Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.